While today's billionaires race to build rocket ships and buy private islands, there once existed an elite class who mastered living in the world's harshest environment. At minus 84 degrees Fahrenheit, these Arctic upper-class families didn't just survive, they thrived. Money doesn't mean much when you're living in negative 84 degrees Fahrenheit weather. You can't eat dollar bills, and they make terrible blankets. Trust me, I tried using my wallet as a pillow once during winter camping, and all I got was a cold ear and an imprint of Abraham Lincoln on my face. For the Inuit people, wealth looked completely different from what we think of today. The first upper class emerged from the most successful hunters, the Olympic athletes of the Arctic who could track a seal from 3 miles away just by spotting a tiny bubble under the ice. That's like finding a specific snowflake in a blizzard, except this snowflake could feed your family for a week. These elite hunters controlled territories spanning up to 50 square miles of frozen real estate. And they didn't just hoard their catches like some prehistoric Scrooge McDuck. Instead, they operated on a principle that anthropologists call balanced reciprocity. I call it the today you, tomorrow me system. By sharing with the community, they built up social credit that proved more valuable than any modern banking system. What truly defined the wealthy in Inuit society was their mastery of survival skills and deep knowledge of the land. Recent studies of oral histories show that elite families could predict weather patterns 3 days in advance and knew the migration patterns of animals across vast territories. Unlike today's wealth, which can disappear with one bad day on the stock market, Inuit wealth was based on skills that took decades to perfect. One fascinating aspect of their social structure was how it handled succession. Unlike medieval Europe, where being born into the right family was enough to make you powerful, Inuit society required each generation to prove themselves worthy. Making a mistake during training didn't mean getting a bad grade. It meant possibly becoming a popsicle. Talk about high-stakes education. Now, you might wonder where these influential families lived during those harsh Arctic winters. And let's start off with their homes. While the average igloo might look like a simple dome of snow to us today, the homes of wealthy Inuit families were the penthouse suites of the Arctic, minus the overpriced coffee shops on every corner. Archaeological evidence from ancient Inuit settlements has revealed that elite families constructed multi-chamber igloos that would put modern open-concept homes to shame. These weren't your basic one-room snow bubbles. The largest discovered multi-chamber igloo site, found near modern-day Nunavut, covered an area of approximately 1,200 square feet. That's bigger than many New York City apartments, and with significantly better views. The entrance to these ice mansions often featured whalebone archways. In fact, having a whalebone entrance was like having a gold-plated door today. Except the whalebone actually served a purpose beyond making your neighbors jealous. These massive bones provided structural support that could withstand Arctic storms with winds up to 100 miles per hour. As someone who once watched their tent fly away during a mild breeze, I can appreciate good structural support. One particularly fascinating aspect of these elite homes was their sophisticated ventilation systems. Using carefully placed holes and snow blocks of varying density, wealthy families created natural air conditioning systems that maintained perfect indoor temperatures. When it was minus 84 degrees Fahrenheit outside, these ice mansions stayed at a cozy 32 degrees Fahrenheit inside. That might sound cold, but when you're living in the Arctic, freezing point feels like a tropical vacation. The real genius came in the construction techniques. Expert igloo builders, yes, that was a real job title and probably the coolest one in history, developed methods to create winter-long ice mansions that could last up to 6 months without major repairs. They used a spiral construction pattern with specific snow block angles that actually made the structure stronger as the surface snow melted and refroze. It's like having a house that repairs itself, a feat modern architects are still trying to figure out. The most skilled builders could complete these complex structures in under 48 hours, working with precision that would make modern contractors weep with envy. Each snow block was cut at a specific angle, typically between 15 to 20 degrees, creating a natural compression that strengthened the entire structure. These builders were so good at their craft that some wealthy families would import them from hundreds of miles away, paying handsomely in preserved meats and valuable furs. Location was everything, just like in today's real estate market. The most desirable spots were those protected from prevailing winds while still offering clear views of hunting grounds. Recent studies of historical Inuit settlements show that wealthy families often claim locations with natural wind barriers, typically reducing wind chill factors by up to 30 degrees. One famous settlement site in Greenland, dated to around 1700, showed evidence of carefully planned igloo placement that created a mini microclimate in the community. The interior layout of these ice mansions followed strict cultural protocols. The most impressive feature was the raised sleeping platform, which could take up to 30% of the interior space. Built from carefully packed snow and covered with layers of caribou furs, these platforms were like the Arctic version of a California king-size bed. Anthropologists have found that some wealthy families' sleeping platforms were elevated up to 3 feet higher than those in standard igloos, literally allowing them to sleep above everyone else. Storage was another big deal. These fancy igloos featured specialized chambers for storing hunting equipment and food supplies. Some had ice cellars carved below the main living space, maintaining a constant temperature that kept food fresh throughout the winter. It was like having a walk-in freezer, except everything was already frozen. Archaeological excavations have revealed storage chambers large enough to hold several months' worth of supplies, some estimated to store up to 1,000 pounds of meat. The most elite homes even had separate chambers for entertaining guests. That's right, they had Arctic party rooms. These spaces were often decorated with intricate ice carvings and lit by multiple seal oil lamps, creating an atmosphere that would rival any modern luxury home's mood lighting. One excavated site showed evidence of a gathering space that could comfortably hold up to 20 people, perfect for those long winter nights when Netflix wasn't an option. But perhaps the most remarkable feature of these ice mansions was their acoustics. The curved walls and domed ceilings created perfect sound chambers for storytelling and singing. A whisper from one side of the main chamber could be heard clearly on the other, nature's own surround sound system. Some elders even used this acoustic feature for important community announcements, gathering people in their homes rather than forcing them to brave the harsh weather outside. All this architectural sophistication required top-notch winter clothing to truly enjoy it. After all, what's the point of living in an ice mansion if you're too cold to appreciate it? Speaking of staying warm in style, the phrase "fashion to die for" takes on a whole new meaning when your outfit is the only thing between you and becoming an ice sculpture. While modern celebrities might drop thousands on designer labels, wealthy Inuit families invested in something far more precious: clothes that could keep you alive while making you look like Arctic royalty. The ultimate status symbol wasn't a fancy logo or brand name. It was the quality of stitching in your sealskin coat. Elite families employed the most skilled seamstresses who could create stitches so tiny and precise that they looked like they were sewn by Arctic pixies. These master crafters could fit up to 20 stitches per inch, more precise than many modern sewing machines. A single mistake could mean the difference between staying dry and turning into a human popsicle. Recent studies of preserved clothing from the 18th century show that wealthy families' garments contained up to 60% more stitches per seam than average clothing. This wasn't just showing off. Those extra stitches meant better insulation and waterproofing. A well-made sealskin parka could keep you warm in temperatures as low as minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit, while a poorly made one might as well have been made of paper mache. Even more impressive was the testing process for new garments. Master seamstresses would subject their creations to rigorous trials before they were deemed worthy of elite wear. One documented testing method involved submerging sections of the garment in icy water for hours to check for leaks. If even a single drop penetrated the seams, the entire section would be redone. Talk about quality control. Fur patterns were the real designer labels of their time. Some patterns were so valuable they could be traded for 100 seals. That's enough meat to feed a family for an entire year. These weren't your basic stripes or polka dots. Master tailors created intricate designs that told stories of great hunts or family histories. One particularly famous pattern, discovered in a preserved coat from the 1800s, used alternating bands of light and dark seal fur to create a design so complex it took archaeologists 3 months to decode its meaning. The fashion wars between regional clan leaders would put modern Instagram influencers to shame. Northern and Southern clans developed distinct styles that were instantly recognizable. The Northern style favored tight-fitting designs with elaborate geometric patterns, while Southern clans went for a more relaxed fit with flowing lines. It was like the Arctic version of Paris versus Milan Fashion Week, except instead of runway models, you had hunters showing off their latest looks while chasing seals. But the magic was in the dyes. Wealthy families had access to special dyes that were harder to get than concert tickets to a sold-out show. These weren't your typical craft store colors. We're talking about dyes made from rare minerals, specialized plants, and even fermented marine animal oils. One particular shade of deep red, created through a complex process involving crushed shellfish and specific types of seaweed, was so rare that only about 5% of the population ever owned clothing featuring this color. The process of creating these dyes was kept secret within families, passed down through generations like a precious recipe. Archaeological evidence suggests that some wealthy families maintained trading networks spanning hundreds of miles just to obtain specific ingredients for their signature colors. Analysis of a preserved coat from 1750 revealed traces of minerals that could only have come from deposits over 300 miles away from where the garment was found. The most elite families took things even further with their accessories. Ivory toggles carved from walrus tusks weren't just functional. They were like wearing a Rolex on every button. These toggles often featured intricate carvings that took months to complete. One particularly impressive example, found in a collection from the early 1800s, contained a toggle with a detailed scene of a whale hunt carved into a piece of ivory smaller than a poker chip. The craftsmanship extended to ceremonial masks and headdresses as well. During special gatherings, wealthy family members would don elaborate headpieces decorated with rare feathers, specially treated furs, and intricate beadwork. Some of these pieces were so valuable that they were only worn once or twice a year during the most important celebrations. Archaeologists have found evidence that certain ceremonial pieces took up to 6 months to complete. Talk about dedication to fashion. Weatherproofing techniques were another mark of status. Wealthy families had access to special treatments that made their clothes water-resistant using a combination of animal oils and specific tanning methods. One technique involved using the liver oil of specific fish species applied in a precise way that took years to master. Modern scientists have actually studied these methods and found them to be more effective than some contemporary waterproofing treatments. The ultimate flex wasn't just having one amazing outfit, it was having a complete seasonal wardrobe. Elite families would have different sets of clothing for various weather conditions and social occasions. Summer ceremonial wear was particularly impressive, featuring lighter materials and more elaborate decorations that would have made showing up in last season's parka a serious social faux pas. All this fancy clothing certainly came in handy during special occasions, particularly when it was time to feast. My grandmother used to say that you can tell a lot about people by what they serve at dinner parties. In the case of wealthy Inuit families, their dinner parties could literally kill you. And I'm not talking about food poisoning from undercooked chicken. Let's start with the most expensive dish in their repertoire: aged whale skin, or muktuk. This wasn't your average aged like fine wine situation. The preservation process was so complex that only the wealthiest families could afford to do it properly. The skin had to be stored in specific conditions for months using techniques passed down through generations. A single mistake in the aging process could turn your fancy feast into your last meal. Archaeological evidence from ancient food storage sites shows that wealthy families maintained specialized aging chambers that could preserve whale skin for up to 8 months. The temperature had to be kept at exactly -4 degrees Fahrenheit. Any warmer and it would spoil, any colder and it wouldn't age properly. One excavated storage chamber from the 1800s revealed sophisticated ice block arrangements that maintained these precise temperatures without any modern technology. That's better temperature control than my first apartment had. Then there was the infamous polar bear liver debacle of the 1700s. Serving fresh polar bear liver was once considered the height of luxury, until people realized it contained enough vitamin A to kill a person. Early explorers documented cases where wealthy hosts accidentally poisoned their guests with this delicacy. It contained about 450 times the recommended daily amount of vitamin A. That's like taking a year's worth of vitamins in one bite. Definitely not what the doctor ordered. The wealthy didn't just have better food, they had better ways of keeping it. Studies of ancient preservation techniques show that elite families developed methods to keep meat fresh for up to 6 months longer than average households. They used specialized salt trading networks that spanned hundreds of miles. One particularly wealthy family from the 1800s was documented to have traded 20 prime sealskins for just a few pounds of rare salt from southern traders. That's like paying a month's rent for a jar of seasoning. Speaking of seasoning, spices from trading posts were worth their weight in gold, literally. Wealthy families would sometimes trade an entire season's hunt for a small pouch of exotic spices. They weren't just showing off, these spices helped mask the taste of meat that had been stored for months. Records from early Arctic trading posts show that some families traded up to 500 pounds of meat for just a few ounces of rare spices. I complain about grocery store prices, but at least I don't have to trade a year's worth of food for some garlic powder. The politics of feast hosting were more complicated than a modern state dinner. Wealthy families were expected to share their rare delicacies with the community, but there was a strict hierarchy to who got what. Archaeological analysis of feast sites shows distinct eating areas, with the most prestigious spots getting access to the rarest dishes. Bone fragment distribution patterns suggest that some guests got prime cuts while others got, well, let's just say they weren't posting their meals on Instagram. But the real mastery was in the preparation techniques. Wealthy families knew secret methods for preparing meat that made it more tender and flavorful. One technique involved burying fish in special soil types for exactly 21 days. Too short, and it wasn't ready. Too long, and you create a biological weapon. These methods were family secrets, passed down with more security than my grandmother's cookie recipe. The presentation of food was an art form, too. Elite families used specially carved serving platters made from whale vertebrae and walrus skulls. These weren't your typical dinner plates from the local pottery shop. Archaeological findings suggest that some serving vessels took months to create, with intricate designs telling stories of legendary hunts. One particularly impressive platter, discovered at a feast site from the 1800s, was crafted from a single whale vertebra and could hold enough food to feed 20 people. Food storage was an art form all its own. Elite families constructed elaborate underground chambers that used different layers of permafrost to create various temperature zones. Recent excavations have uncovered storage systems from the 1700s that had up to 5 different temperature zones, each designed for specific types of food. They were like the walk-in freezers of their time, except they never broke down and didn't need electricity. The most impressive aspect was their understanding of food preservation chemistry, though they wouldn't have called it that. Through generations of trial and error, they discovered that certain types of meat needed to be stored separately to prevent spoilage. They even developed methods to detect harmful bacteria by smell alone, a skill that took years to master and was worth more than all the spices combined. The most successful families could store enough food to feed hundreds of people. One documented feast from the late 1800s reportedly served over 200 guests with 15 different types of prepared meats. The leftovers alone could feed a small village for a week. Of course, getting all that food to the feast required some serious transportation. And that's where the elite's transportation system came into play. If you thought rush hour traffic was bad, try navigating through a blizzard where the roads disappear every 20 minutes. The elite Inuit families didn't just need transportation. They needed a whole system that could handle the world's worst weather while looking good doing it. Speed wasn't just about showing off, it was about survival. Having the fastest dog team in the region was like owning a private jet, except this jet had fur, needed constant feeding, and occasionally decided to chase seals instead of following directions. Archaeological evidence from ancient settlements shows that elite families maintained special breeding programs for their sled dogs. They weren't just picking the cutest puppies, they were creating the Formula One cars of the Arctic. The most prized sled dogs could maintain speeds of up to 25 miles per hour in good conditions. That might not sound impressive compared to a car, but try running that fast in minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit weather while pulling a sled loaded with 500 pounds of supplies. Studies of preserved harnesses from the 1800s show that wealthy families used specialized equipment that was up to 40% lighter than standard gear, giving their teams a significant speed advantage. The training of these elite dog teams was incredibly sophisticated. Wealthy families employed specialized trainers who could teach dogs to respond to over 20 different commands, including specific instructions for different types of ice and snow conditions. These weren't your basic sit and stay commands. These dogs could navigate through whiteout conditions and find their way home from distances of over 100 miles. Some sleds were worth an entire hunting season's catch, and for good reason. The best ones used runners made from whale baleen, which created less friction on ice than traditional wood or bone runners. Tests on preserved sled runners have shown that baleen runners could reduce friction by up to 25% compared to standard materials. One particularly famous sled, documented in the late 1700s, was traded for enough meat and furs to feed and clothe 3 families for an entire winter. The engineering that went into these sleds would impress modern NASA scientists. Wealthy families hired master craftsmen who knew how to cure wood in specific ways to make it both flexible and strong. They would bury certain pieces in snow for exactly 6 months, creating a material that could bend without breaking in temperatures that would snap normal wood like a toothpick. Recent analysis of preserved sled parts shows evidence of sophisticated lamination techniques that weren't rediscovered until the 20th century. But the real status symbol was having knowledge of the best travel routes. Elite families maintained secret maps of safe passages through dangerous terrain. These weren't your typical turn left at the big ice block directions. They were complex guides that took into account seasonal changes, ice thickness patterns, and wildlife movements. One recovered route document from the 1800s contained over 200 specific landmarks and their variations across different seasons. Travel networks were like private highways for the Arctic elite. Wealthy families established chains of supply caches along common routes, spaced about 30 miles apart, the average distance a dog team could travel in a day. These weren't just random storage spots. They were carefully maintained shelters stocked with emergency supplies. Archaeological surveys have found remains of these cache sites spanning hundreds of miles, some containing preserved food from over 150 years ago. The most successful families could mobilize entire hunting parties in hours. Their transportation systems were so efficient that they could respond to whale sightings faster than their neighbors, often arriving first at prime hunting locations. Historical records show that one prominent family in the 1850s maintained a network of lookouts who could alert their hunting party and have them ready to move within 30 minutes. That's faster than some modern emergency response times. Storage facilities for these transportation systems were engineering marvels in themselves. Elite families built specialized shelters for their sleds and equipment, using snow architecture that maintained perfect humidity levels to prevent wood from cracking and leather from rotting. One excavated storage facility from the 1800s showed evidence of ventilation systems that could prevent ice buildup while keeping temperatures stable. The maintenance of these transportation systems was a year-round job. Wealthy families employed specialists who could predict which routes would become dangerous based on weather patterns. They developed methods to test ice thickness by sound, a technique so accurate that modern scientists are still studying it. One documented method involved striking the ice with specific types of bone tools and listening for subtle variations in the echo. These transportation experts were so valued that they often married into wealthy families, creating dynasties of master navigators. Their knowledge was considered as valuable as any physical property, and some families' navigation techniques remained closely guarded secrets for generations. Historical records mention one family that maintained its position as primary whale hunters for over 70 years, largely due to their superior navigation and transportation systems. All this investment in transportation wasn't just about moving people and supplies, it was also crucial for maintaining extensive trading networks that kept wealth flowing between communities. And those trading networks were something else entirely. Running a business is tough, but try doing it when your entire inventory could melt, your customers live hundreds of miles away, and your office keeps disappearing under snowdrifts. The first Inuit trading networks were more impressive than today's global shipping companies, and they did it all without phones, computers, or even a single PowerPoint presentation. The numbers tell the real story. Archaeological evidence shows that some wealthy Inuit trading families managed networks spanning over 1,000 miles of Arctic terrain. That's like running a delivery service from New York to Miami, except your roads are made of ice, your GPS is the position of the stars, and your delivery truck is powered by very enthusiastic dogs who might spot a seal and decide to take a detour. These trading empires weren't built overnight. Records from the 1700s show that it took most families 3 generations to establish a reliable trading network. The first generation would map out the routes and make initial contacts. The second generation would build relationships and establish regular trade patterns. By the third generation, some families had trading partners so loyal they would wait months for specific traders to arrive rather than deal with others. That's customer loyalty that Amazon Prime can only dream about. The most successful trading families didn't just move goods. They created entire economic systems. They developed sophisticated methods of valuing different items across regions. A seal skin might be worth 3 fox furs in one area, but could get you 5 in another. Shrewd traders would map out these value differences and plan routes that could turn one seal skin into enough goods to supply a family for months. It was like playing the stock market, except your stocks were actual stuff that could keep you alive. The secret caches maintained by wealthy families weren't just storage spots. They were the banks of the Arctic. Recent excavations have uncovered trading caches with goods from over 30 different regions, suggesting these families operated something like modern distribution centers. One particularly large cache site, dated to the 1800s, contained over 2,000 pounds of various trade goods, everything from whalebone to rare furs to specialized tools. Security was a major concern, but these families didn't have high-tech alarms or armed guards. Instead, they developed clever ways to protect their goods. Some caches were built with special ice tunnels that would collapse if accessed incorrectly, while others were marked with codes that only certain families could read. One famous cache system used landmarks that were only visible during specific phases of the moon. Try hacking that security system. The trading calendar was more complex than a modern business schedule. Different goods were traded in different seasons, and successful families had to coordinate multiple trading expeditions throughout the year. Historical records show that some families managed up to 12 major trading expeditions annually, each requiring weeks or months of preparation. That's like planning a year's worth of business trips where every trip could kill you if you packed the wrong supplies. Wealth wasn't just measured in goods, it was measured in connections. Elite families maintained detailed records of who owed them favors, who had access to specific resources, and who could be trusted during tough times. These social networks were so valuable that they were often included in marriage agreements. One documented case from the 1850s shows a marriage arrangement that included access to 3 major trading routes as part of the dowry. Talk about marrying into the family business. The most fascinating aspect was how these families handled risk management. They developed systems for spreading their resources across multiple caches and trading partners, ensuring that no single disaster could wipe out their wealth. Archaeological evidence suggests that wealthy families typically maintained between 5 to 7 major cache sites, each with enough supplies to restart their trading operations if others were lost. Modern investment advisors call this diversification. These families called it staying alive. Innovation wasn't just encouraged, it was essential. Wealthy trading families were constantly developing new preservation techniques, better packaging methods, and more efficient ways to transport goods. One family from the 1800s became incredibly wealthy by developing a new way to preserve seal oil that extended its trading life by several months. They kept this technique secret for 3 generations, creating what we now call a trading monopoly. The most successful traders were masters of timing. They knew exactly when different communities would need specific goods and planned their routes accordingly. Some families developed calendars so accurate they could predict when certain communities would run low on supplies months in advance. It was like having a weather forecast for economic conditions, except this forecast could mean the difference between feast and famine. All this trading expertise required extensive knowledge that had to be passed down carefully from one generation to the next. And that's where education came into play. Getting a private tutor today might cost you an arm and a leg, but in the Arctic, bad education could literally cost you those body parts to frostbite. Wealthy Inuit families didn't send their kids to fancy boarding schools. They created the world's most extreme educational system, where getting an F didn't just mean failing a class, it meant failing to survive. Private tutoring and hunting techniques makes modern SAT prep look like a game of tag. Young members of elite families started their education early, usually around age 6. By that time, I was still trying to figure out how to tie my shoelaces, while these kids were learning to read wind patterns and track seals across miles of ice. Archaeological evidence shows that wealthy families built special training areas where young hunters could practice their skills. One excavated site from the 1800s included a mock hunting ground with artificial seal breathing holes, basically the Arctic version of a flight simulator. The expensive art of weather prediction wasn't just a hobby. It was a life or death skill that wealthy families guarded more carefully than my mother guards her secret cookie recipe. Studies of oral histories reveal that elite families develop prediction methods accurate up to 85% of the time. That's better than some modern weather apps I've used, and they have satellites. These techniques were so valuable that some families would only teach them to their own children, creating dynasties of weather experts who could read the sky like a newspaper. Star patterns weren't just pretty lights in the sky, they were the GPS of the Arctic. Wealthy families invested huge resources in teaching their children celestial navigation. Young students had to memorize over 100 different star configurations and understand how they changed throughout the year. One documented teaching method involved creating detailed star maps in the snow. Imagine having to redraw your textbook every time it snowed. Expert navigators could determine their location within a few miles just by looking at the stars, which is more accurate than my phone's navigation when I'm downtown. The training was so intensive that wealthy families constructed special teaching igloos designed specifically for education. These Arctic classrooms were built with features that help demonstrate various survival skills. Archaeological findings have revealed teaching igloos with specially designed wind tunnels that demonstrated weather patterns and ice windows positioned to track star movements. One preserved site showed evidence of a teaching igloo that could hold up to 15 students, the Arctic equivalent of a private academy. Special navigation skills were passed down through intensive training programs that would make modern boot camps look like summer vacation. Young members of elite families spent months learning to navigate by feeling snow texture through their feet, listening to wind patterns, and even tasting snow to determine their location. Historical records from the 1800s describe students who could identify their location during a blizzard just by tasting the snow and feeling the wind direction. Meanwhile, I still get lost in shopping malls. The most valuable lessons weren't written down. They were encoded in stories, songs, and riddles. Wealthy families developed complex memory systems that could preserve hundreds of years of knowledge without a single notebook. One documented family from the 1850s could recite their hunting territory boundaries through a series of songs that took 3 days to perform completely. That's like memorizing an entire atlas, except the atlas keeps changing as the ice moves. Education wasn't just about practical skills, it was about understanding complex systems. Young members of wealthy families had to learn how animal migration patterns connected with weather systems, how ice formations affected hunting strategies, and how social networks influenced trade relationships. They created mental maps of their world that were so detailed, modern scientists are still trying to fully understand them. One elder's knowledge, documented in the early 1900s, contained information about ice patterns that helped climate scientists understand 200 years of Arctic weather changes. Testing wasn't done with paper and pencil, it was done in real-life situations with real consequences. Students had to demonstrate their skills by successfully leading hunting expeditions, predicting weather changes, and navigating through difficult terrain. The success rates of these tests were actually documented. Historical records show that by age 15, children from wealthy families had about a 90% success rate in supervised hunting expeditions, compared to the community average of 60%. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this education system was how it adapted to changing conditions. When new trade goods appeared or new hunting techniques were developed, wealthy families quickly incorporated this knowledge into their teaching. They were like the world's most extreme continuing education program, where staying current meant staying alive. These educational achievements were carefully considered when arranging marriages between powerful families. After all, what good was a huge hunting territory if your children's children wouldn't know how to use it? All this knowledge and training made young members of wealthy families extremely valuable in the marriage market. And that's where the politics of marriage alliances get interesting. Modern dating apps have nothing on traditional Inuit matchmaking. While today's singles swipe right based on profile pictures, wealthy Inuit families were playing a much more sophisticated game. One where a good match could mean the difference between controlling half the Arctic or ending up with nothing but a cold igloo and some disappointing seal blubber. The statistics paint a fascinating picture of just how calculated these marriages were. Historical records from the 1800s show that about 80% of marriages between elite families were arranged when the future bride and groom were still children. That's right. While most kids were playing with toys, these youngsters were already part of complex political alliances that would make medieval European royalty look amateur. Intelligence gathering before marriage arrangements would put modern corporate mergers to shame. Families would send scouts to observe potential matches from other wealthy families, sometimes for years. These scouts would compile detailed reports about everything from hunting success rates to family trading connections. One documented case from the 1840s showed a family maintaining observation of a potential match for 4 years before even initiating marriage talks. Talk about thorough background checks. Wealthy families maintained their status through carefully planned marriages that would make a chess grandmaster's head spin. Each match was analyzed from every angle: hunting territories, trade routes, special skills, and family alliances. One documented marriage agreement from the 1850s included a 14-page oral contract later written down by explorers detailing everything from hunting rights to emergency shelter access. My rental lease is shorter than that. The elaborate courtship rituals weren't just for show. They were complex negotiations disguised as traditions. Before a marriage could be arranged, the families would spend months exchanging gifts and demonstrating their wealth and skills. One particularly ambitious father in the 1800s sent his future in-laws a different rare gift every day for 3 months straight. That makes modern engagement rings look pretty unimaginative in comparison. Skills assessment was a crucial part of the matchmaking process. Young people from wealthy families had to demonstrate their abilities in everything from navigation to weather prediction before being considered eligible for marriage. Archaeological evidence shows special testing grounds where potential matches would showcase their skills. One preserved site included an obstacle course designed to test hunting abilities, like an Arctic version of American Ninja Warrior, except failing meant staying single. Dowries went way beyond the usual wedding gifts. Some included entire hunting grounds that had been in families for generations. The largest recorded dowry, documented in the late 1700s, included exclusive rights to a whale hunting territory, 3 major trading routes, and enough supplies to outfit 10 hunting parties. It was like getting the keys to an entire business empire, except this empire was made of ice and required exceptional survival skills to manage. The preparation for these marriages could take years. Families would stockpile special foods, gather rare materials for ceremonial clothing, and construct special celebration igloos. Archaeological evidence shows that some wedding preparation sites were active for up to 2 years before the actual ceremony. One particularly elaborate preparation site from the 1800s contained storage rooms filled with preserved delicacies from over 20 different regions, the Arctic equivalent of a high-end catering service. Marriage ceremonies for wealthy families weren't just day-long celebrations. They often lasted an entire moon cycle. These weren't your typical wedding receptions with bad dancing and rubber chicken dinners. They were month-long festivals that served as trade fairs, political summits, and social networking events all rolled into one. Archaeological evidence from these celebration sites shows remains of feasts that could feed hundreds of people for weeks. The timing of these ceremonies required more planning than a modern space launch. They had to be scheduled when the weather was stable enough for guests to travel, when food was plentiful, and when multiple families could gather without disrupting hunting seasons. One famous ceremony was postponed 3 times because the whale migration patterns changed. Try explaining that to your wedding planner. Living arrangements after marriage were equally complex. Newly married couples from wealthy families often had to spend time living with each clan to learn their unique hunting and trading secrets. This wasn't just getting to know the in-laws. It was like an extended corporate training program where failure could mean getting fired from the family business. Historical records show that some post-marriage training periods lasted up to 2 years. The most successful marriages created alliances that could control vast territories. Archaeological evidence suggests that by the mid-1800s, Some allied families through marriage controlled areas larger than modern-day Connecticut. These weren't just random patches of ice. They were carefully selected territories that included prime hunting grounds, safe travel routes, and strategic trading locations. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect was how these marriages maintained peace between different groups. When two families joined through marriage, their hunting territories became shared resources. Historical records show a 60% decrease in territorial disputes between communities that were connected through elite marriages. It was like a peace treaty sealed with "I do" instead of signatures. These complex marriage alliances created powerful family networks that were often overseen by the most respected members of the community, the wealthy elders. And these elders had powers that went far beyond just giving life advice. You might think your grandparents have some pull in family decisions, but wealthy Inuit elders made them look like amateurs. Combining the status of age with the power of wealth created a level of influence that would make modern CEOs jealous. These weren't just wise old folks telling stories by the fire. They were the Supreme Court, Weather Service, and Board of Education all rolled into one. Raw numbers tell an interesting story about elder power. Historical records from the 1800s show that decisions made by wealthy elders were followed by the community about 95% of the time. That's a better success rate than most modern governments. When a respected elder from a wealthy family spoke, people listened harder than teenagers paying attention to their phone notifications. The healing ceremonies these elite elders could perform weren't your basic take 2 seal oils and call me in the morning treatments. They were complex rituals that combined generations of medical knowledge with social influence. Archaeological evidence has uncovered special healing chambers in wealthy settlements, some dating back to the 1700s, where only the most powerful elders could practice. These chambers used sophisticated ventilation systems to control temperature and humidity, basically the Arctic version of a modern hospital room. Wealthy elders didn't just give medical advice, they were living libraries who could recall hundreds of years of tribal history. Their memories were so precise that modern scientists have used their recorded knowledge to track climate changes from centuries ago. One elder, documented in the early 1900s, could describe weather patterns from 80 years earlier in such detail that climatologists used his accounts to verify their computer models. That's like remembering what you had for breakfast every day since first grade, except this information could save lives. The special sleeping quarters built for respected elders would make 5-star hotels look basic. Archaeological findings show that some wealthy elders had private icehouse chambers with multiple rooms, raised platforms, and even specially designed ventilation systems for optimal sleeping conditions. One excavated elder's quarter from the 1800s had a sleeping platform elevated 3 feet higher than normal, literally putting them above everyone else while they slept. Talk about high-class accommodations, but their real power came from their ability to change an entire tribe's hunting grounds. When a wealthy elder suggested moving to new territory, it wasn't just a casual recommendation, it was like getting a direct order from Mother Nature herself. Studies of migration patterns show that communities would sometimes travel up to 100 miles based solely on an elder's advice. That's like having your whole town move because your grandmother had a feeling about the weather. These elders didn't just make random decisions, they based their judgments on decades of observation and knowledge passed down through generations. Records show that wealthy elders maintained mental maps of hunting territories that included information about ice patterns, animal migrations, and weather systems spanning thousands of square miles. One documented elder could predict seal movement patterns with 85% accuracy just by observing subtle changes in wind direction and ice formation. Their private ceremonies weren't just for show either. Historical accounts describe healing rituals that combine practical medical knowledge with complex social ceremonies. Some wealthy elders maintained special collections of healing tools and medicines that were worth more than a year's hunting catches. One documented healing kit from the 1850s contained rare plants from trading routes spanning over 1,000 miles. That's some serious medical networking. The sleeping arrangements weren't just about comfort, they were strategically designed for community leadership. Elder quarters were often positioned so that they could observe both the natural environment and community activities without leaving their rooms. Think of it as the Arctic version of a corporate corner office, except instead of watching stock prices, they were monitoring ice movements and social dynamics. What made these elders truly remarkable was their ability to combine practical knowledge with social wisdom. They didn't just tell people what to do, they created complex systems of social organization that could handle everything from food distribution to conflict resolution. Their decisions about resource allocation could mean the difference between survival and disaster for entire communities. From those first power structures built on hunting skill to the impressive ice mansions they called home, through their fashionable furs and epic feasts to their sophisticated transportation networks and complex trading systems, the wealthy class of traditional Inuit society created something remarkable. They built a world where survival skills were more valuable than gold, where knowledge was the ultimate currency, and where being rich meant something far more meaningful than having a full bank account.